Creating fireworks in LightWave is a really easy thing to set up using the particle system. Let's take a look at creating some. I'm going to start by, I've got my default scene. I'm going to start by going over to the dynamic object, particle. I want to add a particle emitter, and this one, let's call it shoot. We're going to shoot off like a bottle rocket. So I hit OK, and it opens up my FX Emitter panel. I can always access this in the object properties, but by default this will pop up. And let's set it up so that, well, first let's set it up so that the birth rate is just 1. We're going to shoot off 1 particle, and let's generate by frame. So on the first frame it's just going to fire off 1 particle. The nozzle sphere is fine. For size effect, I find that I'm in better shape when I set it to no change for the size. I think it used to be that by default. I found that if you don't change that to no change for the size, then you might have trouble setting up the exact particles that you want because it's making some changes based off these settings. So I go ahead and keep that to no change. For particle limit, I'm just going to go ahead and say let's just have 1. We're going to have 1 particle fire off. If I push play, I can see 1 particle just sitting there, and I want it to do something. So I'm going to go over to motion, and for velocity, let's have it fire up. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. Okay. We can see the particle now is firing up, but it's just 1 particle because that's what we told it to do in the generator tab. It's generating 1 particle and then it's firing up, and I'm going to have it fire over a little bit as well. So now it's firing up and over to the X. So let's say that that's what we want, except, well, you know, there's gravity, so I'm going to go over to the etc. tab, and under gravity I'm going to give it a little gravity. So now it shoots up and it starts to fall down. I want it to shoot up a little bit more, so this works for me. So now I've got the particle shooting up and dropping down. One thing you might notice is that all this time I've been able to have the timeline playing, which allows me to kind of see in real time what my particle is doing. It makes it, for me, it makes it quicker to kind of get the settings that I want. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this. And now what I want is when the particle fires up and when it meets its end, which is at frame 60. So if I were to change this, let's just change this to 120 frames. Okay, so the particle goes and at frame 60 it disappears. Well, why is that? Well, if I go over to the particle tab, I can see that the lifetime for my particle is 60 frames. So when it hits 60, it dies off. So it's born at 0 and it dies off at 60. So we're going to use that to our advantage. One thing that I want to do is when this fires up and dies off, I want it to explode, like you see with most bottle rockets. So to do that, I need another particle emitter. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Items tab, Dynamic Object, Particle. This one I'm going to call Boom. It's going to be the explosion at the end. Hit OK. And let's take a look at the settings for this one. Well, first I'm going to make sure I'm on frame 0, and I'm just going to move it over so that we can see the difference between the 2 particle emitters. And by default, again, for size effect, I'm going to change that to no change. That's going to help me make sure that I know the settings that I need to use, and it's not going to give me a different output of what I'm expecting. For birth rate, let's just bring that down. Let's say I'm going to try 30 particles. And for the nozzle, instead of sphere, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit M for motion options, and I'm going to change the parent for that. I'm going to change that to shoot. Okay, so now this is parented to shoot. Now I accidentally sized it down a little bit there, so I'm just going to bring that back. So if I were to move this around, you can see that that the second particle emitter is parented to it. So back here, I'm going to change the nozzle to parent emitter end. What that's basically saying is it's going to use the particle that's been fired off, and when it dies, that's when it's going to use this particle emitter, and that's where it's going to spawn. So let's push play, and if you notice, it goes up, and when it dies, you see a little yellow. Well, it's not very impressive. We need to dress this up. So I'm going to keep this playing, and I'm going to come over to, let's come over to lifetime. We'll keep that at 60. For motion, let's take the vibration and let's up that. Okay, I can kind of see it's changed, it's moving a little bit, but what's happening is it's using the motion from the parent. So we're going to need to get rid of that. And on the etc tab for parent motion, I'm going to change that to 0. Okay, and now it shoots off a little bit there. So let's see. Fires off that particle there. I'm going to go back to the generator tab, and instead of generate 30 frames per second, I'm going, generate 30 particles per second. I'm going to do it per frame. Okay, and now on the first frame that the particles are going to be used, it's firing off 30 particles. Okay, now the reason why they're kicking out in all the different directions is because of the vibration. So if you want them to go a little bit more, well, we could do 8. There we go. But I also want to have a little bit of gravity. Now I don't want too much gravity because the particles would be light. So I'm going to try -2 and just see. That might be too much. That's not bad, but I'm going to go -1. There we go. So now I have the particle firing off. Then I'm using this particle emitter to emit the particles when that particle dies off, when the lifetime runs out. Let's see if we can add a couple more. So I'm going to select this particle emitter, go to the generator, and it's not updating here, so that's okay. I'm going to close this and hit P for properties, and under the FX Emitter particle information here, I'm going to change the birth rate to 2 and the limit to 2. So now it's firing off 2 particles, and they're both going, but they're firing off at the exact same time, and they're dying off at the exact same time. Well, what I'll do is go over to particle, and under lifetime 60, I'm going to say, well, it could be 50 or 70, or it could be, I'm going to change it to 20. Okay, so now I'm randomizing when they die off. So you get 2 different bursts instead of them both bursting at the same time. Okay, so now that we have that, why don't we dress it up with some hypervoxels? Because right now nothing would render. We've got just particles. If we wanted just the particles to render, we could convert them to partigons, but in this case let's just use hypervoxels. So I'm going to go ahead and close this Object Properties tab, and to launch it I'm going to hit Control F6 to open up the Volumetrics tab, and under Add Volumetric I'm going to choose Hypervoxels. Double click to open the panel. I'm going to move that out of the way here so that we can kind of see what's going on with our particles. And for the boom, I'm going to double click, which is going to activate it. For the object type, I'm going to change it from surface to sprite, and then I'm going to show particles. Okay, and the particle size says 0. I'm going to change that to 0.25, and let's see. Okay, there we go. So now we're starting to see the particles, and they're white. I want to kind of dress that up, so I'm going to go over to the Shading tab, and under Color, I could just give it one color, like let's use this blue. So now the sparks or the fireworks are blue, but what if I want to have them change over time? Well, I'll go over to the texture editor for the color channel for the hypervoxels, and for layer type I'm going to choose gradient, and for the input parameter, instead of previous layer, which I don't even have a previous layer so it'd just be all white anyway, I'm going to choose particle age. What that means is I can control, based on the lifetime of the particle, I can control its color. So I'm going to change the end to 60 because by default it's 30, but we know that our particle lasts for 60 frames. So For when it starts, let's make it red. Okay, so now we've got red, and then I'm going to have it as it starts to die off. Let's go orange, let's go yellow, and then we're going to start getting really dark as it dies off. Okay. So as we can see, as the particle moves through its lifetime, we can see up here in the end result that it's going to change color, and then it starts getting darker, and then of course it disappears. Now I can shoot off as many particles as I want. Right now we just have 2, but we can shoot off as many as we want. So hopefully this has given you a quick idea of how we can go about building fireworks relatively easy in LightWave using the particle systems, and take it as far as applying some hypervoxels on them so that they'll render.